you now with Enrico Casella, who will, he's a student of Professor Silvestri, and he's going to talk about temperature. In particular, how many rubles should I spend on my air conditioner? Well, it's not quite that, but it's something like that. So take it away.
Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So this is can you all see the slide?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, so this is a work that I recently submitted to Infocom 2021. And so I'm just gonna jump right into it. I wanna start from the title just because it's packed with a few of the topics that we're gonna talk about. So how much for your temperature, exploiting machine learning and reverse auctions for HVAC demand response. And here I highlighted some of the terms that I want everybody to be familiar with. And we're gonna start with HVAC. So HVAC stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. So basically you can think of this as just the thermostat in your house or whatever cooling heating system you have. Now, in order to get to the other key terms, first I want to give you a big picture of what is it that we're dealing with. So you can picture a scenario where you have on one side a utility company that provides energy, electricity to a given amount of residential buildings. And so the main goal of this work is suppose that there is a very high demand from all these houses that are just requiring a lot of energy for different reasons. There can be a situation in which we see that there is a peak of demand, and that can be a concerning situation for different reasons. And so the goal of the paper is to reduce this peak and basically reduce the demand of all the houses. So the key term to take away is peak load reduction. Now, why is this a problem? Well, when there is a peak, you might have a situation where the demand keeps growing until it even maybe reaches capacity. And this may lead to a blackout, and so there would be an interruption of service, and that is a big discomfort for the users and for the utility company as well. Now, from the utility company point of view, you also have, as you can see on the graph, basically the cost of creating energy at some point increases exponentially, and it is in an interest of the utility company to decrease the demand so that they basically save money. And from what we've seen, it is actually a lot of money. And so you also heard me talking about residential buildings. So of course, residential buildings are not all that is connected to the smart grid, but the reason why we talk about that is that because of urbanization and just increasing number of households, the residential buildings contribute heavily on the overall consumption. And then I've been talking about HVAC. So among all appliances, why am I talking about HVAC? Well, the reason is that according to the US Department of Energy, around 51% of the power consumption is due to the HVAC over a whole year. Moreover, the literature shows that when there are these peaks in demand, these are usually associated with extreme outside temperatures. So it's either really hot or really cold. And so you can imagine how that 51% is probably going to be even higher in those situations. So tackling the issue of peak load reduction with HVAC makes a lot of sense. So peak load reduction, here's another key term, demand response. So the idea is that we want the users to change how they're using and interacting with their appliances in order to reduce the peak load. And there's basically two types of demand response. One is price-based and one is incentive-based. So the price-based, you can think of it as something like this. So you can have different different costs of the electricity during the day. And it's kind of like a static approach where you can imagine during these hours of the day, it's going to be a lot of demand. So we put a higher price. Similarly, you can also have a real-time pricing where instead the price just changes in real time according to what is the use of the users. Now, the problem is that with this approach, basically the users are not really aware of what is going on, and they usually don't really change their behavior that much. And so they're not responsive. And in order to solve this problem, we have the incentive-based demand response with the main goal of involving users more. And so one way to do this is through direct load control. So the utility company may have an agreement with the customers where they say, we give you this discount or we reward you with this money if you let us control some of your appliances during the day. Now, this clearly is kind of invasive, and most people are not really willing to do this. And so another possible approach would be shift load. So the idea is that you may have in your house some appliances that you don't really use all the time, such as dishwasher or dryer. And so the idea of shift load is to, whenever you're going to use some of these appliances, you're prompted with a message that says, hey, there is really high demand right now. Why don't you do this later and you get some money in return? Now, the problem with this is that it may happen that there is a peak and there not many people are actually using those appliances. And so that's where the demand side bidding comes in, which is basically what we do and what I will talk about a bit later. So here is the system overview. This is what we do. Again, on one side, you have the utility company. On the other side, you have connected houses. And so the idea is that the utility company sees that there is a peak in the demand. And so it prompts, the users are prompted with a message saying, hey, would you change the thermostat set point and basically, let's say in the summer, increase your temperature by 2 degrees or whatever amount, so the users can decide what temperature they feel comfortable with and how much money they want for each possible option. Then we have a machine learning model that predicts for each one of these options how much energy is going to be saved. And then all this information is plugged into what we call a reverse auction. So you can think for now of the reverse auction as just an optimization problem that takes all this information together and wants to decrease the overall power consumption, but at the same time, we have the goal of not causing too much discomfort in terms of temperature difference to all the users. And also, we want to try to minimize the cost of rewarding these users. And so there is basically 3 main areas that I'm gonna talk about. And we're gonna start from the reverse auction. So again, consider n users connected to the grid. So at the moment when the peak is detected, we define .P as the power consumption of each user in that specific moment. And so if you sum all these values together, then you have the total power consumption PT. Then we want to decrease this PT, which is the peak, and we want to take it down to some fraction of the total power consumption that we define as PC. You can think of it as a power cap. And so the goal is to save an amount of power that is the one highlighted by the gray area in the plot. So it's the difference between the total power consumption and the power cap. Now, I talked about the bids. So those are the options that the users feel comfortable with, the temperatures that they are allowed to have in their houses. And so each bid consists of a thermostat set point coupled with a monetary reward. And then the machine learning part takes care of calculating what is the power saved for each one of these options. So we put all of this information together. On the left, I just summarized the main information that we need. And on the right, I have the optimization problem that we formulated. So starting from the objective function, here what we try to do is minimizing the discomfort of the users in terms of the temperature difference that they have from the default settings of the thermostat compared with the new settings. And also we want to try to keep the cost as low as possible. We then define the first constraint, which is the decision variable. So it's a binary variable. And with the constraint 1c, we're just saying that for each user, you can either select one of their bids or you don't. But you cannot select more than one because you can't have two temperatures at the same time. And then finally, the last constraint basically saying that we want to have a cumulative power saving across all the users that is greater than the power saving that we need to reduce the peak. And now the problem with this is that we proved that the problem is NP hard, and so we developed a heuristic to solve the optimization.
Enrico?
Yes.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
In the previous slide, could you tell me what PIJ referred to?
Yeah, so I is the index of the user. So we have n users from 1 to n. And then J is, we consider that each user can submit either 0 or m bids. And so J indicates which option from that user we're considering.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I now see it. Yes, thank you.
All right. So again, we formulate this heuristic approach, which I'm not going to talk too much in details for time purposes. But basically, the idea is to have a list where we sort the objective values in ascending order, and then we basically keep trying. So we take the first element, see how much power saving that we bring, and then we keep iterating through the list until we're satisfied with the total power saving. So I'm now going to talk about the machine learning predictions. So in general, when it comes to energy prediction of a house, there is two ways to do it. One is called a white box. And so you can think of this as a physical model that takes into account all the variables of the house. And when I say variables, I mean footage of the house, the rooms that it is composed of, and the materials of the walls, the windows, the roof. And you have to formulate just a bunch of equations that define the thermal conditions of the house. And then another approach is purely based on data. And so it's usually machine learning, deep learning, and it relies on the fact that the energy consumption is usually, it has patterns. So whenever we have the same conditions of weather or internal indoor environment conditions, then you will have a similar power consumption. Now, the problem with the first approach is that if we think of our system as a large-scale system, then getting to know all the characteristics of each house is just basically impossible. And so we want to use the second approach, which is the machine learning. But here the issue is that we can't really rely on historical data. And what I mean by that is that since we are going to change the thermostat set point, we're actually going to drastically change the behavior of the energy consumption. So relying on what has happened in the past under similar conditions is not useful. And so at this point, we we tried to solve this problem. And at the beginning, looking at the literature, we thought that it would make sense to create a signal of the power consumption. But because the peak load reduction is usually an emergency scenario that you can imagine it lasts for a given amount of time, in our case it lasts for an hour, then what we really want to know is how much power we're going to save. So we don't need to create a whole signal across the whole hour, but we just need a number. And so by thinking of the problem in this way, then all we need to predict is a number. And we try to solve this problem with a regression algorithm. Now, again, we keep in mind that we want to adopt, ideally, the system on a large scale. So we need information that are easy to obtain. And so we rely on the following information. We use the current state of the house in terms of inside temperature, the current thermostat set point, and the time of the day. And then, of course, we need to know the new thermostat set point, so the new temperature. And then we rely on the weather information, so outside temperature, humidity, and wind speed. And this is a bit of the summary of what our machine learning model looks like. Finally, I'm going to talk about the survey. So the idea here is that we want to model how users would actually behave when they are asked to change their temperature and how much money they want. So in the survey, we ask the following questions. We start by asking them what is the typical thermostat set point that they usually have during the summer days. We're only focused on summer in this work. And then we ask, what is the highest thermostat setting that you would be willing to set? So at this point, they can also say that they're just not willing to change the temperature. In that case, the survey just ends. But assuming that they do want to change, then they tell us maybe they want to change by 4 degrees. Now, for each option between the typical set point and the highest set point, we ask them how much money they want. And so we keep the range between $0 and $5, which is what other people have done in the literature. And we just take this data and use it for our simulations. Here I just show some of the results of this survey. So initially we had 200 participants, and from the graph on the left, you can see this is a total of 139 users were comfortable with having at least 2 degrees of flexibility, basically. And then on the right, we try to show what is the trend of the financial reward that the users would ask.
Were these actual people or were they simulated people?
Actual people. So we used Amazon Mechanical Turk, and we focused on the area of Florida. So these are users from Florida. Before diving into the experiments, I'm going to talk about the data collection. So of course, we didn't have houses to collect data from, but we use this software which is funded by the US Department of Energy. It's called EnergyPlus, and it's a very high fidelity energy modeling engine that has access to a bunch of information about the house. So again, you can think of this as the white box that I described previously. You can model everything about the house, what material you use, what is the composition of the house, or you can even schedule like what appliances used at which time, the occupancy, and all of this information. And so we used models that were already made by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And just to have heterogeneous models, we tried to use different type of houses and try to manipulate the data a little bit. So we have houses with 4 different foundation types. Some have basements, some have heated basements, and so on. And then as a heating system type, we focused on electric resistance and heat pump. And then we tried to find a parameter of the house that would give us even more heterogeneous models. And so we found this parameter that's called U factor, is a parameter of the windows. And it has a range of 0 to 7, with 0 being the value that basically where the thermal condition of the house is maintained in the worst way, and then the 7 being a very good thermal capacity. And so using 4 different foundation types and 2 different heating system types, we got 8 models, and then multiply those 8 models by 5, we got 40 different models. So going into the experiments, I'm first going to show the results of our machine learning approach. So here we evaluated the accuracy of our models in terms of the error percentage. So here we see that basically 98% of our data set has an accuracy that gives us predictions with an error below 15%. And then with this other experiment, basically the idea is, let's say we want to deploy this system on a large scale, then we need to prove that our system can learn the predictions pretty fast. And so this experiment shows how many samples are necessary, how many data points are necessary for the model to perform well. And we measure them in terms of explained variance, which is a score that is not very popular, but it is useful to evaluate the performances of regression models. And then we also use median error. Now going into the reverse auction experiments. First, I have to preface that we do compare our model with a state-of-the-art approach. So in these slides, we refer to our approach as REPEAR, and we refer to the comparison approach as FLAIR. And then what you see referred as PK, that's perfect knowledge. So instead of using machine learning, we use the actual real data from the EnergyPlus simulator. And where you see PRED, those are the machine learning predictions. So overall, you can see that our performances are close to optimum, while the comparison approach does not perform as well. And on the right side, you can see that all approaches basically stay below the power cap. So it successfully reduces the peaks. However, you can see that the comparison approach is kind of like a bit excessive. It brings a little bit too much discomfort to the users, and therefore ending up reducing the peak a bit too much. Here we evaluate what is the average temperature change across all the users for each approach. And again, we see that basically we have performances close to optimum. And on the right side, we see how much money the utility company needs to pay the users. And here I have conclusions. So we have a demand response program. We developed the demand response program for the HVAC. We develop a machine learning model to predict the power savings. We carry out an online survey that not only gives us realistic big values to model the user behavior, but also it shows us that quite a few people seem to be willing to change their thermostat set point for just an hour on some summer days. And then we develop a heuristic algorithm to solve the optimization problem, and we compare our approach with the state of the art. That was all. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Yes, I had a question.
Yeah.
if you considered an alternative to rather,
Mhm.
I know you're going to have some method to be able to do measuring to get the values you need from the individual home or
Yeah.
your virtual home that you have there in your simulation. But is there a way to do the measuring without having an invasive, say, mechanical way into the home? Have you considered that?
So ideally, I think that's what the direction that we try to push in. So ideally, we're thinking we have a smart home. The smart home will have smart monitors, and we can have the actual power prediction, actually the actual power consumption. But now the thing is that once an emergency scenario happens and there is a peak, you're just looking into the future. You can't just read what is the power consumption. You need to basically foresee what would be the consumption under different circumstances. So you can't really read because it has not happened yet. Did I get
Yeah.
your question correct?
You know, the number of probably housing that exist in the U.S. today, they don't have all smart homes. I know that they may be in different areas in Northwest and also in California, but there are many places in the United States that don't have that.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I'm just thinking of more of a way that you could find a measurement technology, and I'm just asking the question, just came to my mind.
Yeah.
So that's all. It's just trying to address that.
Yeah. So the idea here is we are trying to propose a scenario that with current technology would be possible, but of course, before we get to an actual large-scale adoption of the system, it will take some time.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question about the bids. Would you expect in practice that you would ask everyone maybe at the beginning of the season for their bids, and then when you finally find a peak that's too high, you then just apply those bids that you already have? Or would you expect a new bidding round periodically or every day when there's a peak that's too high?
Yeah, so ideally, I think the best option would be to have the utility company developing a model to predict when those peaks are going to happen. And so it would make much more sense for the company to ask each time. So whenever the utility company sees that there is going to be a peak like in 1 or 2 hours, then that's when they send the message and ask for the bids, because you can suppose that maybe a user is not home at that point, and so they're willing to really change their temperature a lot because they don't care. They're not going to have any discomfort, and they might even ask a lower amount of money. So I think it makes sense, depending on what you're doing during the day, to be asked in that very moment what you feel comfortable with.
That sounds very invasive in a different way. I get messages all through the day saying, hey, there's a peak coming up. Please give us bids, give us 5 or so. That's, I can tell you what the power company here does. A number of years ago, they installed, for a reduction in the monthly rate, a device on the air conditioner, which if they need to, they can cut it out for an hour. They can just turn it off from external. It has nothing to do with my thermostat. I don't have a smart thermostat, but there is this smart cutoff switch, and they can control it. And it was just a one-time installation and a periodic rate adjustment because of it. That seems a lot less invasive.
Yeah, that's true. Even though I believe that's like you make a deal, you allow them to do it every time, and sometimes we might just not want to. It becomes uncomfortable, but so it's a trade-off. I guess as of now we have not looked into which option we want to do. We just started with this work where we want to have the very core of how the system would work. So there is a lot of, I guess, social behavior that comes into play, and so I don't really know what would be the best option. And I think a mix of the two would be best, where the users would have like a default set of bits, but they can also just be prompted with a message when a peak is detected and change their values if they want to.
I think it would be an interesting sociological question. What are
Yeah.
people really willing to bid, and how will that change over time? I can also mention that early on in the talk, you said that having different rate schedules, different time of day, doesn't work so well. When I lived for a year in Ireland, that's what they did for electricity. That
Yeah.
there were two rates, and everyone's water was heated electrically. And so everyone had a timer, and it would turn on the water heater at night. And then there'd be enough hot water for the day. And
Yeah.
it was just because everyone recognized it's cheaper to do it that way. If you needed hot water, there was an emergency override. You could turn that on in the day. So such a fairly simple solution also seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess that would be an approach that is more for users to save money on a daily basis. But I think what we're trying to look here is more of an emergency situation. So when a peak is detected, changes need to be made in that very moment. And so, yes, maybe that approach would prevent a peak, possibly. I don't know. But here the idea is that once the emergency hits, what do we do? So.
You had this parameter C, which essentially determined the fraction that you wanted to expand, or to put it differently, how much you would want to save. Do you have any feeling how this C affects things? Minimal C probably would be very easy to obtain. Yeah, here. But large value for maybe it's PC, or maybe I meant actually alpha.
Yeah.
This parameter alpha, how your results change when you change alpha from 0 to 1?
Yeah. So I think I didn't mention it. In our case, we set alpha to 0.95. That's something that we would like to do, seeing how changing this alpha would impact the results. What we know from the literature is that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the cost of creating energy increases exponentially, and it seems that decreasing this consumption, even from like 3 to 5%, would save a lot of money. There is a study that says that reducing 100 gigawatts would bring savings for 13 to 37 years of cost of creating energy. So yeah, the idea is that the peak does not need to be reduced that much. And
yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much, both of you, for interesting talks. And next time I'll remember to announce also the password. Some people had to send me email to get the password. I'll announce that as well. And I'll see you all next week. We'll have Drs. Goldsmith, Jacobs, and Calvert talking about use of archives for technical papers, and perhaps another talk as well. Or maybe it'll change. Anyway, we'll see you all next week. Keep current and keep safe. Bye.
Thank you, sir.